Hi there, my name is Kyle Hall. I'm a student at Tarleton State University, and today we're going to be covering a topic out of Business Ethics Now by Andrew Gillier. Specifically, we're going to cover the critical thinking portion of Chapter 3. This pertains to Johnson & Johnson and how they handled the incident on September 29th, 1982. This is when 7 people died in the Chicago area because their Tylenol extra strength capsules had been tampered with, and in fact, they were swallowing cyanide. It didn't take very long for the news to break nationwide. This is a big issue, and I think Johnson & Johnson handled it most exceptionally. What they did was right off the bat recalled 31 million products across the United States, recalling all Tylenol extra strength in the United States, even though their advisors had told them only to recall those in the Chicago and Midwestern area. This cost them in excess of $100 million. Before this disaster, Johnson & Johnson held 35% of the market share in painkillers. Immediately after, they were down to 7%. However, a little less than a year later, after fixing their products, figuring out what was wrong, and a pretty solid marketing campaign, they were back up to 28% of the market share. Part of the reason the executive team of Johnson & Johnson decided to pull all the Tylenol extra strength from the shelves was because the credo that their founder, General Robert Wood Johnson, had written in 1943. It stated, "We believe our first responsibility is to the doctors, nurses, and patients, to mothers and fathers, and to all who use our products and services." Johnson & Johnson is a huge corporation. They have massive bank accounts, and that's what allowed them to pull through this issue. It cost them in excess of $200 million to fix this. The question's been raised that if they were a smaller company, perhaps in financial straits, should they have handled the situation the same way? I say yes, and here's why. Johnson & Johnson got ahead of this problem. They recalled all products across the United States, and I think that's what allowed them to regain the trust of the citizens, of their shareholders, their stakeholders, everybody. Because if they had tried to hide this problem, if they had only pulled the product to Chicago and told everybody else it's okay, and yet something else happened somewhere, they'd be done. Nobody would ever buy Johnson & Johnson products again, especially Tylenol extra strength. Johnson & Johnson acted both reactively and proactively in this situation. Obviously, they were reactive when they pulled all the products from the shelves. They were proactive, however, in the sense that they immediately began to make changes. They looked for the problem, looked for a solution. They could never find the person who did this, but they did work on making more tamper-proof products, and they ensured that any products that were possibly affected weren't in the hands of the consumers. Another example of how Johnson & Johnson was reactive was by offering to either replace or refund any Tylenol products. A proactive example is that they added a third layer of protection, of tamper-proof protection, so that it would be easier for someone to spot a potentially deadly bottle of Tylenol. Tylenol, in addition to the federal government, made a lot of changes following this national issue. One of the things that was done was in 1983, a bill was passed making it illegal to tamper with sealed medication. Another was on the forefront of science. Tylenol developed a type of paper that would react when it came in contact with cyanide. When Tylenol destroyed their products, they destroyed 31 million bottles of Tylenol extra strength. That's a lot of painkiller. Some people have wondered if it would have been better to send that to a third world country. Perhaps it could have been used some. Well, I don't think so, and I think that would have been very unethical, and here's why. There is no way to test every single pill and every single bottle. Now, they did say they were going to do some spot checking, and they were going to make sure that none of it was tampered with. However, there was an article in the LA Times in 1985 that stated that scientists that reviewed some of the infected bottles, if you will, the ones who had the cyanide capsules, stated that both the boxes and the bottles did not look tampered with. So there's no way that you could check every single bottle. So you would be potentially poisoning someone in a third world country who wouldn't know any better. Because it's possible by the time the medicine was distributed over there that they wouldn't even know to be looking for a tampered bottle. All they know is they have medicine, and hopefully it was going to fix their ailment, but instead they dropped dead. I don't think that a bottle of Tylenol is worth anybody's life. Do we need to send more medicine over there? Yes, but I don't think the solution is sending them our trash. Because nobody's life is worth somebody getting a headache alleviated, because that's what we're doing. The Tylenol extra strength, Although it is very handy, it can reduce fevers and it does make pain go away. It's not a life-saving medication, and therefore we should not take that risk. While it is true that citizens of third world countries need help, they're no less human than us. We're all equal, and they're not a dumping ground for our botched medicines. Although they need medicine, I'm sure they're not desperate enough to roll the dice on whether they're going to drop dead over a bottle of Tylenol or not. If they are that desperate, then I think that says a lot about us. I know that we can't help everybody, but if someone is in need of Tylenol that bad, perhaps we should focus more on helping them out. Apparently, no family member sued Johnson & Johnson, and I think part of this reason is there is no moral grounds for them to sue Johnson & Johnson. The evidence that we have been able to discover is that these bottles were possibly purchased or shoplifted from a store, taken home, someone made it through the packaging, replaced the pills with cyanide capsules, and put them back on the shelves. That in no way indicates that it's Johnson & Johnson's fault. Furthermore, two of the infected bottles were traced back to their manufacturer. One of them was produced in May in Pennsylvania, and the other was in July in Puerto Rico. It seems very unlikely that a handful of bottles from factories halfway across the world could be infected and then both end up in Chicago. Therefore, I don't believe that Johnson & Johnson had any fault. If they had elected to only recall products in the Chicago area and not nationwide, and someone had perhaps passed away elsewhere in the nation, that could have been their fault. But instead, they got ahead of the situation and resolved it in what I deem to be the most ethical way possible. Speaking financially, it would have been a wiser decision for Johnson & Johnson to only recall the Tylenol Extra Strength in the Midwest or Chicago area. But instead, they decided to follow the credo of their founder and their code of ethics, and they recalled it across the entire United States. To this day, authorities have been unable to determine the individual or individuals who replaced the Tylenol capsules with cyanide capsules. There was one suspected, James Lewis, but he was never convicted of anything besides extortion. The executives at Johnson & Johnson had to deal with a pretty rough situation that was dealt to them. It wasn't their fault or their employees' fault that cyanide was placed inside their Tylenol Extra Strength capsules. But it happened, and they dealt with it. They didn't focus on finances, they focused on their stakeholders, and that's the way a company should behave. We all know that hindsight is 20/20, especially in a situation like this 36 years later, but I really don't think there's anything that Johnson & Johnson could have done differently in this situation. It was a rough one, that's for sure, but I believe they did everything they could to ethically resolve the situation. They ensured that no more consumers would be harmed, even though they were in no way at fault for the contaminated Tylenol Extra Strength capsules. In conclusion, I think that Johnson & Johnson did everything right, and that companies today should take note. This may have been in the past, but this is definitely something they should learn from. That way they can be proactive in case something similar happens to them. Thank you.